All right. So my name is Don. Don Bora. I'm the co-founder of 8-Bit Studios and the co-founder of Mobile Makers. 8-Bit Studios, we develop mobile and web applications. On the mobile side, we do primarily iOS, smattering of Android here and there when it's required. And on the web side, we do Ruby on Rails. So I have a lot of experience with doing native mobile and responsive mobile. So who in here, I'm just trying to get a sample of who's here. Who is a developer? All right. Who's UX? Wow. Who's design? What the heck did the rest of you do? Strategy. Okay. Any content people? Okay, cool. So there's a lot of different perspectives in the room, and everyone's going to have different, probably different reasons for coming here. So I'll try to hit on most of it from my perspective. So I'm mostly going to talk about the app development process, what we care about when we develop, what the design process is a little bit, how we weave things in and out, and also the UX experience as well, or the UX process and what we do. I'll be talking about native and user experience as well, or I'm sorry, native and responsive as well. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to just stop me at any point and let me know. So in addition to being co-founder and helping run these companies, I'm also a coder. So I actually do code every day. Believe it or not, I still am a geek at heart, and I still totally nerd out with new stuff. So don't let the jacket, I can't take the jacket off because they've got me wired up. So don't let the jacket fool you. When the jacket comes off, I look like some street urchin coder guy. So all good. So a little bit about myself. I have a degree in linguistics and software engineering, and I got those degrees in 1989. So it was pre-web, but post-internet. So we were actually emailing back and forth back then, and I spent a year in Germany, and I met a girl from New York, and I was in New Mexico, and I actually traversed the dot notation to get email to her from my school, which was kind of a military school. Not a military school. We did a lot of military work, all the way up to the ceramic engineering school in New York, and that dot address was like 3 lines long. So I was pretty impressed with myself. And this was what like I said, just barely post-internet, internet, but pre-web. That's just a kind of a, I don't know, smattering of my coding background. For those of you that can't read, Basic, Pascal, Modula 2, Lisp. Most recently, a lot of Objective-C, Swift, and Ruby on Rails on the web side. I've done Java, I've done C# on the web side, and I'm probably one of the only ones that can actually say I've used most of the web technologies to build web products. In fact, I built my first web app in 1993, which was the year Mosaic was introduced. So I'm that old. So you have any questions about like how old the web is or what we used to do before the web, come ask me afterwards. I'm well versed in that. I kicked off a high school entrepreneurs program 2 years ago, and it was like full of 15s and 16-year-olds. And the questions I got, two that stood out in my mind. One was, what was the internet? What were computers used for before the web? It blew my mind. It was such a cool question. And the other one was, how did you get software before the internet? So I had to explain, like, I had just like started with CDs, and I went to floppy disks, and they're all like they have disks, and I'm like, yeah, you know what? Like I don't know, I couldn't identify with them, so I just picked a random song, and I said an eighth of that song could fit on the disc, and they were just like, oh my god, it was so cool. So that was a lot of fun. What's that? I said punch cards. No. I missed punch cards in high school by 1 year. Although I did do COBOL in high school, so that's a moniker I'm very proud of. So a little bit about the mobile space and the background, and the golden days are over for developers, kind of, sort of, a little bit as far as UX and design is concerned, because back when the iPhone first came out, there was one size. And it was, 320 by 480? So it was great. Developers would give us comps. We would just throw them in the background, and we'd place elements over the top, and it was fantastic. It was great. We could do pixel perfect on day one. It was awesome. So if they wanted to change anything, we just open up the project and start moving things around. It was great. All right, then the iPad came out, and that changed the form factor completely. So for those of you who don't know, when you develop for iPhone and iPad and iPod, it's the exact same code we use. We just use a different user interface layer. So it's the same code underneath, same source code, but if you're familiar with web page design, that HTML layer right there, that would be the metaphorical equivalent. That's different. So no big deal. We have completely different form factor for iPad and iPhone. That's fine. But then they introduced the 5S, or the 5 and the 5S and the 5C, which all have the 5-inch screens. And then we got into trouble because now, instead of pixel perfect placement, we had to basically roll the clock back to web and desktop development, where sizes of screens and sizes of windows can change. So now we had to take that design and make it look good for multiple device sizes. And developers aren't really that good at making things look good. Apologies if there's any developers in the room that are good at that. I stink at it. So I'm like, yeah, okay, it looks kind of good, but I don't really know. I mean, that font's fine for me. It's Helvetica, whatever. I don't care. So I'm bad at that. But as I tell my students, it's my job to code. It's my job to make sure it doesn't crash and it works well and it does exactly what UX and design wanted to do. So their job is to make it look and feel awesome. So I respect that line, and that's the kind of line I toe at my shop as well. So at 8-Bit, we're very, very, very conscious and respectful of each other. At the founding level, I run tech, my partner runs UX, and my other partner runs design. So between the three of us, we're really, really concerned about making sure the experience is seamless throughout the entire process. So I'm really, really passionate about design, but I did it for like a year, and I suck at it. And I was thinking about throwing a slide in here to show you how badly I sucked at it, but nobody needs to see that. So then, just recently, the iPhone 6 and iPhone 6 Plus came out and totally threw us over. Plus which, we got a new dev tool, a new version of what we call Xcode, which is what we code on for native iPhone apps or iOS apps. And we got kind of thrown into the deep end of figuring out how all these things relate to each other on the screen. So they're no longer placed, they relate to each other. So I can't put this at 10:10. It has to be roughly this much from the front, top, roughly this much from the side, this much from this area, this angle, this element over here. And the thing about this, the reason I'm giving this so much attention is because it's all brand new. This technology of having things relatively distant from other components on the screen has been around for like 20 years, 20 plus years, but 30 years. But the way that Apple chose to solve this problem has changed dramatically. So every time that you're dealing with an iOS developer that's making things for iOS 8, we're dealing with a brand new technology for making this happen. So go easy on us, because we're not, I mean, some of it's like trial and error trying to figure out how this works. The blogs aren't up to date yet. The tutorials aren't up to date yet. Apple's guidelines are catching up, but it's still a bit of a nightmare for us, and we're still kind of feeling our way around what are called the constraints and layout issues. One of my former students is in the audience right now. She knows exactly what I'm talking about. It's the most painful part of our job right now. Question mark says we don't know what's next. I never thought, none of us ever thought that iPhone 6 Plus would exist. Because has anybody seen one? They're ridiculous, right? I mean, I saw some woman using it on the L, and it looked like she was about to put an iPad up to her ear. It was ridiculous looking. So I don't get why people want that, because until the iPhone came out, I was going smaller and smaller and smaller in my phone choices. Yeah, and then the iPhone came out, and I'm like, ah, damn. And then when Objective-C came out, so they didn't release the SDK initially, they said, oh, you can use web pages for it, whatever. But when Objective-C came out, I've been coding Objective-C since '92. I was like, oh my God, I have a career again. So I jumped right into it, and I had to get a phone. So essentially, I kind of had to abandon the nice little small device I used to have in my pocket, and had this, like, what I already consider as a monstrosity. But then the iPhone 6 Plus came out, and I don't know. Feels a little weird to me, but that's all right. I'm probably very old when I'm talking like that. So this is kind of what we're up against in the UX meets design meets iOS world. So we've got, what is it, 5 different device types, okay? And what iOS is doing for us developers right now, they're calling them device classes. So, and I can share these slides afterwards, so if you don't want to try to take pictures, I can give these to you. So we've got these different device classes, and within the device classes, we also have different devices. And these different devices have different capabilities, right? So the iPod Touch can't do what the iPhone 5 can do, right? Because there's no cell phone in it. There's no cell subsystem. The iPhone 5 can't do what the iPhone 5C can do. Well, actually, they can. The 5C and the 5S are different chipsets. So these are all things that developers have to take into account when we're developing. And one app that you design for all devices might not work for all devices because functionality might just not be there. For instance, the iPhone 6, I think, has 2 NFC chips and a couple accelerometers in there. Well, as far as I know, we only have 1 accelerometer in the 5, so we're a little bit restricted about the accuracy that we can get when dealing with movements. So you've got the different device types up there, and then you've got the different resolutions up there, right? So it's not too terrible. I mean, I talk about it like it's apocalyptic, but it's really not that bad, right? I mean, there's only like a few things we have to take design to meet engineering with. So in the grand scheme of things, I'm not going to complain too much about what's going on up here. I am, however, going to complain about this. This is the Android world, and this is a small subset of all the device types out there. Okay, so in the iPhone world, let's see if I can do this. I'm not very good at presentation. There we go. In the iPhone world, we have looks like 4 different resolutions, but really we've only got actually 3 different resolutions. We have standard, we have what they're calling 2x, and now what they're calling 3x. They did that 3x thing for engineering reasons, not for aesthetic reasons. When you come up to here, the sky's the limit. It's whatever device manufacturer wants to do. And every device manufacturer is pushing the display limits right now to try to get an edge up on their competition, right? So Samsung's competing with Motorola when it comes to devices, and Google doesn't care about any of this. They don't even care about the operating system. So when it comes down to updating a phone, your iOS, Apple owns the device and the software, so they've got a real invested interest in having you update your phones. Because the more recent you are, the more you're going to be pulling in the latest apps, the more you're going to be using the latest features, and the more you're not going to be able to live without certain things, right? So now who can live without checking in at certain places? My wife can't. She checks in everywhere. So that wasn't available two and a half years ago. So they want to get users kind of hooked on this new technology. That's putting it a little cynically, but Apple's got an invested interest in making sure that we update all of our devices and update to the latest OS all the time, right? And they control the phone and the software so they can make sure that experience is seamless and very tight. And they don't care about the carriers anymore. While on the Android side of the puzzle, the carriers are in charge of everything. And the device manufacturers are only putting flavors of Android on there. And those flavors of Android might be slightly different even inside of the versions. So when we look at the market share for Android, it scares the hell out of developers. Because if we've got to develop for 4 versions in the past, that's a nightmare. If you think about 4 versions ago in iOS, that was the iOS 3, what is it, 3S? 3S. Think about what the iPhone 3S could do versus what the iPhone 6 Plus can do. If you think about writing software for that limited device, forget about accelerometer, it's not there. So any cool games you use or any cool technology you use to leverage that accelerometer, or the geofencing that's capable, that we get now with the really super sensitive GPS technology, forget it, it's not going to be there in 3. We have to develop for 3 or 4 versions ago on Android, and it makes the job really difficult, not to mention the graphical nightmare it takes to make all those screen resolutions and all those form factors and all those different resolution types happen. Now remember, Apple controls all of the resolution types because they control all the hardware. Samsung and Motorola, I guess those are the big players right now. They're competing against each other, so always trying to one-up each other in screen technology. So that's a big problem for development, and that's a big problem when you start to consider what you're going to develop apps for. So, when we've got a client coming to us, they're usually gunning for iOS first because iOS has a slight US market share, and Android is dominating globally, right? So that's one of the things that we take into account when we develop software for these devices. Yeah, that's all I have to say about Android because I'm really not a big fan. I spent 11 years doing Java, not a fan. So the breakdown of iOS versus Android. So iOS uses Objective-C and Swift as its native language of development, meaning that when developers go in, they're developing in a language called Objective-C or Swift. Swift just came out, what was that, 4 months ago? 3 months ago? So yeah, 4 months ago. So we're all kind of trying to get into it. And Apple was really clever about this because I know for myself, I was thinking, man, I really love Objective-C. I'm totally. It goes back to my early coding days in the early 90s with Smalltalk, and I really love the language. Its nuances that piss a lot of people off, it's endearing. It's kind of like being married for a really long time. I really like some of those weird features. So I was really into it, but at the same time I was thinking, man, am I going to be stuck doing Objective-C for the rest of my life because I'm in mobile? I hate Java. I spent 11 years there. I'm not going back. Is Objective-C my life? I don't want to do Ruby. No offense. I don't want to do the Ruby, what is it? What's that thing called? No. It's there's a Ruby engine that you can take Ruby apps and make apps for iOS. Can't remember it. I don't want to do that. I like to do native apps. And a lot of us were thinking this way. So then Apple came out with Swift, and we were just like, oh my God, there's something to learn. Like there's something that I can really seriously dig into because it's so different, and it's pretty much an amalgam of, I guess, I would say like 6 popular languages that it's very exciting for me to dig into. So they did a really clever job at coming up with Swift because now a whole bunch of developers are really excited, and we've basically got renewed life. Apps live in the App Store, for good and for bad. So we put an app in the App Store, and we basically release it to the App Store, and it takes anywhere from 2 to 5 weeks to get approved based on volume, based on what time of year it is, based on what features there are, based on the content. It's a walled garden, but there's also 400 million apps in there, so it's not that much of a walled garden. But there's a process to get it into it. And since there's 400 million apps in the App Store, it's a bit of a power struggle right now with marketing. It's like the URL land grab of the 90s is happening right now with naming land grab of app names. So when you choose an app name, you can only hold on to that app name for, I think, 90 days. If you do not submit a binary to the App Store in 90 days, you lose that app name forever for yourself. So there's no more squatting on, there's no like domain squatting on the App Store. So that's one really nice thing. But there's 400 million apps, and how do you distinguish yourself from any other app in the App Store? That's a marketing problem. Content strategy in the room, thank you. That's your problem to deal with, not mine. Apple owns and makes all the developer tools. So this used to be a bad thing until about 3 years ago when the developer community for iOS became a real big market for Apple. When that happened, Apple's senior executive team really started to pay attention to the developer tools. I've been using Apple developer tools since they came out, and they were crappy to use for many years and very frustrating. Now they're pretty good. They're still behind the times. They're still maybe about 4 or 5 years behind Visual Studio. It's a Microsoft tool, but it's pretty good and it's getting better, and they're paying a lot of attention to the UI and design side, meaning that someday in the near future, I can actually see whoops, what happened? Oh, you know what that is? I've got that screen thing that turns my screen yellow when it's dark outside. So now all your eyes get a break because this is soothing. Everybody feels soothed? So the new Apple developer tools, they're very much concentrated on helping with design integration. So I can see something in the near future where I can throw a designer at Xcode and they might actually be able to do things in there. In fact, we're at 8-Bit Studios, we're going to actually experiment with it this winter. We've got a brand new creative director, and he's really itching to kind of get in there and help me solve this problem. So I'm pretty excited by it. On the, right, so approved apps only. We already went over that. And we get a high user upgrade rate, right? So Apple's very invested in that. So when we're putting products out on iOS 8, or iOS rather, we're pretty much going to be guaranteed that that user is going to be running the latest software. And what's nice is that Apple end-of-lifes 2 versions. So we don't have to support iOS 5 or 6. That's awesome. Well, maybe 6, because 6 still runs on the 4. But that's nice. We don't have to support 5 anymore. So that's great for me. On the Android side, we have Java, which is a pretty established language. I give it a lot of grief, but it's been around since 94, 95. So it's got a really established base. It's been thrown around a few orphanages. I think Oracle owns it now. So it's a little weird that Oracle owns it, only because they used to be a database company, and I don't want to get into all that. Google Play is extremely open, right? So you can put an app in Google Play, and it pretty much goes in hours. It's really quick. So if you have a client and they want their app up at Christmas, well, you can put it up December 22nd, and you're fine. If you got the same scenario in the App Store, you're panicked. You want to get that thing done by December 1st. There's not a whole lot of apps in Google Play, so not nearly as many as there are in the App Store. So your market visibility is better, and you have a better shot at being globally recognized. The tools, however, for Android are all open source, with the exception of maybe 1 or 2. So Eclipse is a commonly used, what we call integrated development environment for app development for Android. And it sucks. I've used Android in a bunch of different flavors for about 8 or 9 years. So I can say with great authority that it sucks. There's many different flavors. There's Android Studio right now, which I believe is Eclipse-based. And there's IntelliJ that, right? And there's IntelliJ that is it's a pay-for product. It's a really, really good suite. But none of these work right out of the box. I'll give you an example. We have an Android developer that was working on an app, and I wanted to see if I could get in there and help, because I did Java. All of you know now I did Java, and I don't like it very much. So I wanted to get in there and just see if I could help for the weekend, because it was a crunch time on a project. So I thought it couldn't hurt. I mean, maybe if I do 1 or 2 things, it might help. So I spent about 2 hours. I downloaded the software. I tried to configure it. I wasn't getting anywhere. I said, all right, I'm going to be able to get much faster if I get the developer over here to help me out, because the guy's my age, and he's been doing this for a while. 4 hours later, we still didn't have the thing up and running. I mean, it came up and running, but it wouldn't run in the simulator or the emulator. And I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. And all he could do was shake his head. So I don't know. Maybe that was like inexperience, or maybe that was just a snafu on my laptop. But the tools for developing an Android are not nearly as mature as Xcode is on iOS. I can download Xcode and get Hello World running within minutes of installing it. I can't do that with any of the Android tools. So that's a bit of a barrier. It takes a while to set it up. There's no approval process for the app, so that's great. Once again, I put it in the store, it just goes live. So that's fantastic. If I want an app in there, in the store on Christmas, like I said, release it 2 days before, we're fine. The biggest problem, development environment, and I'm not picking on Java, but Java aside, the biggest hindrance to developing software for Android is honestly the user base. The fragmentation on devices and operating systems makes it hard for us to develop for Android. It's not insurmountable, it's just hard, and sometimes cost prohibitive. It usually takes us, we've estimated that it usually takes about 20 to 50% more budget to develop for Android than it does for iOS. So that's significant, and nobody wants to hear that. So there's a big kind of, I don't know, every once in a while, religious argument about native versus responsive. So what's the difference? Does anybody know what does anybody understand native versus responsive? Who gets that? Who understands what that is? All right. For those of you who don't know or are too shy to raise your hands, I thought he raised his hand, but he's just doing the camera work. Do you know the difference? All right. So native means it's been written to run on the phone. So for instance, the Facebook Paper app, if you run that on your iPhone, that's all native. Well, we'll call it all native except for the content. The content's coming from their servers. The Mail app, Mailbox, Airmail, Calendar, Contacts. What's that? Dropbox. Yeah, well, that's a tough one. But yeah, Dropbox. Those are all native apps, meaning that they're written 100% at Objective-C, 100% using Xcode, and they're running natively on the machine. That means they've been compiled, and they're running as fast as they possibly can on that device, right? So there's a pretty powerful little processors, like the quad-core processors now in these things. So these are pretty powerful processors, and only native software can really take advantage of all the speed there through compiler tricks and coding and coding optimizations. All right, so that's native, right? Responsive is basically a web page that's been written in such a way that it will scale nicely to whatever form factor we're in. So if you're on, let's say, CNN.com or maybe Yahoo, and you start dragging the size of the window around, like drag the corners, you'll notice that the content really, really nicely scales with you. Or it'll stop scaling at some point. You'll get scroll bars at the bottom. That's responsive design. So responsive design is basically responding to the screen size or to the view size that you can view the content in. So a good example of a responsive, a really, really well done responsive design is the Netflix app. So when you download the Netflix app, you're actually downloading an Objective-C shell. It's an installed app that runs on the phone natively, but it's pulling in all of its content via the web. Okay? And the reason you can tell this is because your gestures aren't quite working the way you want them to work. You'll start to drag across, but that's all jQuery doing its work. So jQuery is not a multi-touch framework because multi-touch does not exist on the desktop. We only have one mouse, right? So jQuery is not up to snuff, and we don't believe it will ever be up to snuff. It's had 5 years now to come up to multi-touch standards, and it's simply not there. So whenever you see some weird behavior, that's basically a responsive app thrown inside of a native app. So why would you do a responsive app inside of a native app like that? Well, you get something in the App Store, right? So Netflix has something in the App Store. They don't have to they don't have to hire developers to do a custom, custom app. They don't have to do any custom players. They don't have to do any kind of streaming upgrades or any streaming technology specific for mobile because they're using every single thing they've developed for web as it exists now. So it's a huge cost benefit for Netflix to do something like this. And if you guys remember back to, I guess, 3 years ago, the Facebook app on iOS and how bad it was. So Facebook is a great case study for us in mobile because what they did was Facebook has been leveraging a mixture between native apps and responsive app. And so about 3 years ago, they went 90% responsive, and that's when it started to be a really, really bad user experience. That's when things weren't responding, like you couldn't drag things. It was really, really weird to get things working, right? If you remember that, it was terrible. And that was when they had that little home screen dashboard that popped up. It was awful. But then they started to work in more native pieces again and roll back on the responsive design. But what was cool about that is that we got to see what that looks like without spending any money doing it ourselves. Like all of us in the app dev community went, this is fantastic. This is great. We don't have to worry about this at all. We can always look at the Facebook app and just know what that looks like. So it was a fantastic case study for all of us who didn't ever want to go in and do this experiment ourselves because let's be honest, Facebook's got the volume that we just can't duplicate anywhere. And I will get back to native versus responsive later because there's more to talk about there. So let's get really boring for a second and talk about the development cycle. And I gotta watch my time a little bit, right? Because, I'm doing okay. I'm doing okay. All right, settle down. All right, so Xcode allows us to develop code right out of the box in a simulator. And this actually, this works for Android and iOS. So no matter what we're doing native development-wise, we're using an integrated development environment, what we call an IDE, to develop our software in Objective-C or Swift or Java. And we either run it in a simulator, which is just this chunk of window that runs on the screen next to us, or we can compile it directly to our device and run it there, right? So that's a really rapid dev cycle, and we get to basically develop our app on our device, on our laptops, really, really quickly. And it's kind of like crack. I mean, I've never smoked crack, but if I can envision what that would be like. It's the first time I saw an enterprise developer do web, and he was like, oh my God, the feedback was so amazingly rapid. Like, you make a change and you just reload and it works, and you're like, oh my God, I can see that changing. It's worse with mobile. If there's any mobile developers in the room, they know exactly what we're talking about. I mean, you hit run and it's there, and all the animations are just working. You know, like, my God, this is fantastic. It's graphics are the opiate of the world, and when we develop for these things, we get that such rapid feedback and serotonin pumping through our heads. I know I sound crazy, but it's actually why we do what we do. So once we get through with development, we can start giving this out to our quality assurance or user acceptance teams, and we do that through many different. There's many different ways to do this. One of the most popular ways is test flight, and there's other things. I think one's called hockey something or another. I can't remember what it is. We'll all jump ship soon if Apple screws up test flight the way I think they might screw it up. But anyway, we distribute our apps through email, basically. We basically give you an email invite. You go to your email, say, all right, I want to install this app. It takes you to the test flight website, and you download your app, and it's great. So it's a way to distribute the applications to a select set of testers without going through the App Store. So you get your client's got 10 or 20 users. They want to test the app. Great, let's do it. So then once you're ready, once you're done with QA, then you want to deploy it. So Apple, I don't know, every 6 months or so they change how this works. And every 6 months or so we have to go in and figure this out from scratch again sometimes. So basically it's a process of adhering to the 100 or 200 or so tiny little things that we have to get right in an app, including icon sizes, resolution, color, how many icons you have, placement of text, keywords. There's so many things to keep track of. You basically upload it to the App Store. Then it goes into review, and it takes 3 or 4 weeks, or 2 to 4 weeks. How long did yours take? Oh, you had a problem. 2 weeks total, even with the problem.
No. Well, the problem is third party.
Right. So in you mind if I single you out here? All right. So Meredith's case, she developed software that worked with this orb, all right, one of these little robots. God, I'm still sounding like an old man right now. Sphero, thank you. It was really, really cool, and it was the talk of the mobile makers at the time. And when she submitted the app, the company that made Sphero had not sanctioned her app yet. They hadn't gotten back to her. So Apple rejected the app based on that. So Apple rejections can go far and wide. I had an app rejected for reasons of profanity and pornography and defamation of character. It was a little, it was a kind of a satire thing about Joe Biden and his teeth. And it just fell under the pornography thing. I don't know why. I guess the guy's that good looking. So they can reject your app for any reason. It'll all show up here in the app submission process. That's basically how the app development process works for mobile. Ready? This is what it looks like for responsive design. It may seem a little simpler, but it gets a little crazy. So on the website, we've got HTML, jQuery, whatever flavor of web technology you're going to use. You're going to use Python or Django, Ruby or Java or whatever. That's all fine. That's all development. You can develop all that natively on your laptop and throw it into a web browser and then run a simulator against it to make sure it works. The people that are testing this would have to run the simulator, and that's a little tricky sometimes because the simulator only comes with dev tools, but it can be managed. The tricky bit comes in these two areas right here. So typically in web development, we at least have what we call environments, 2 environments for releasing software. We have one environment that we typically call staging, which is a mirror of production, which blah, 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 has data on it, blah, blah, blah. We put our app there to test it out. Then when we're all done testing it, we put it in production, right? And usually we have little programs called scripts in place that push all the code out and test things, and it's all wonderful. But usually this is the environment we're seeing for a responsive app. It's going to be living on 2 servers, ideally 2 separate servers, and it's a bit of a headache to manage these environments when you compare it to a native app. What's that? Well, I was going to say ideally it's 2 servers, but sometimes they get crazy. I worked at Bank of America. We had 13 environments for a production app, so it can get crazy. Absolutely. Yeah, we should talk later. All right, so let's get back to native versus responsive. So on the native side, when we're developing an app, if that app is going to talk to a back end, or let's use Facebook again as an example. Facebook's a native app. It's going to be talking to the Facebook servers to get its data, right? So it's going to be sending up the user ID and password and getting an authentication token back, and you're going to use that token to make an API call to get your status, to get like your feed or whatever, to get the stupid pictures of cats that your mom insists on posting, to get your sister complaining about her kids. This is spoiler alert, this is my life. So you basically need to code against an API to get all the content down from the server. That's what a native app would do. Your native app is going to be in the App Store, and it's going to be highly responsive. UX and design can blow it out. It's like a playground for UX and design, I feel. Because has anybody here used the Facebook Paper app? If you haven't used it, I would at least go watch a YouTube video on it, because they did some amazing things. They set the bar way high on UX. They used what was called Quartz Composer, which is an old Mac tool, for doing basically graphical origami. So folding and wonderful transitions and very smooth animations for card animation. It's just wonderful UX. Amazing. And everyone saw that and went, I've got to have that. So the UI responsiveness that came with that app is impossible to do in responsive. Completely impossible. If I ever see it, I'll be blown away amazed. But the closest thing we can come to is like Google Maps, right? Which does a pretty good job at taking users in and out of an experience. But even that can get kind of a little janky on a web browser. Excuse me. 1 second. And for a native mobile app, you get a curated experience. You can do pretty much exactly what you want to do experience-wise. If you want to gamify something, it's pretty easy to get in there and figure it out. You have all these native frameworks and libraries at your fingertips that are already set up to do so many things, you don't have to reinvent the wheel to do that. So if I want a 3D spinning whatever, and it's going to be in a game and it's going to interact with things, in iOS I would throw it against SpriteKit, or in Java I would throw it against maybe OpenGL. And it would be somewhat, it wouldn't be trivial to do, but the experience would be well worth it. You wouldn't be able to get that experience out of responsiveness, once again, because you don't have multi-touch. That multi-touch is huge. Remember, on the web, on a desktop, you have a hover state and a touch state. On mobile, you don't. So there's no way to respond to a hover state on mobile, right? It gets really, really complicated when you start to try to take that responsive experience and make it feel native, which is where a lot of things fall short. So on the responsive side, what do we get? Well, we get a separate UI build out, meaning that we get a code base, and then we get possibly different UI elements on top, or UI pages on top that would talk to that code below it, right? Or we get pages that have very complex JavaScript or HTML or CSS derivatives to make it so that when we show up on a screen that's 320 by 480, it looks perfect, right? We have one code base. Well, that's very nice. So now I'm Netflix, and I've got the Netflix web application. And if I want to go on iPad or iPhone or iPod, okay, admittedly they're all one platform, or Android or BlackBerry, or Windows, I've already got my code base. All I have to do is muck with the UI and I'm all over the place. That's very attractive. Some clients or some users or some businesses simply don't need to be native. So if you don't need to be native, why would you waste the money doing it? It's a case, we take this as a very case-by-case basis. I personally prefer a native experience over a responsive experience, but there's plenty of use cases that it works just fine. The Gap's iPhone app, Nordstrom, I think they all use the same app. Netflix, they're all using responsive design and they all do their job pretty well. So I'm not going to complain that much about it because, it's fine. Normal users aren't going to even notice it. You might not even notice the Gap app was not native, the iPhone app, unless I'd called it out to you. The iPad app, completely different story. You get really quick updates. So remember, when you update to the Apple App Store, that's a 2 to 3 week turnaround, maybe 1 to 2 week turnaround for updates, right? So that's your worst case scenario. I don't know what Microsoft's doing, and Marketplace is not a problem at all. But for Apple, you're going to have to wait around for at least a week. Mobile responsiveness, instantaneous. You deploy it to the server, you're done. That's pretty awesome. So you already know how that your responsive environment is not going to handle multi-touch. So you're going to simplify your UX, right? You're going to go maybe large form factors. You're going to cut out a lot of clutter on your screen. You're going to really, really hone it down so that your UX isn't complicated because the users can't take advantage of it anyway. So why bother, right? So there's a cost saving there as well. Also, like I think I already said this, it runs on all devices. It just does. I mean, you don't have to worry about it. As long as you're running in a modern browser, you can run on BlackBerry for crying out loud, right? I shouldn't pick on BlackBerry because they're doing a really good job at the OS level. They just can't do market at all. So this is from our creative director, and he basically just asked him, like, what do you do? What do you care about when you design for mobile, native versus responsive? So basically, he says what kind of we say at the development level. Define your needs. Somebody's laughing already. I don't know what I put in there. I might have a typo in there or something. Define your needs. Does the client or does this product need to be native? Is it a storefront? You got to make those calls, right? I refuse to go in and do all native when it doesn't need to be because it's a waste of money and they could use their money in so much better ways. Yeah.
Give me an example of an app that absolutely needs to be native. Would it make sense for being responsive?
You play games?
Yeah.
So an app that I was asked, give me an example of an app that needs to be native. You ever play Limbo on the iPhone?
No.
All right, that would need to be native. Any 3D scrolling game would need to be native. The camera app needs to be native. The photo album app needs to be native because you need to be able to pinch and zoom, right? Apps I prefer be native. Why don't I just look at my phone here? What's that? Well, no, because responsive. Oh, if you don't, yeah, that's true. If you're not going to use the internet, you have to be native, right? Let's see, what has to be native here? Remarkably little has to be native. I prefer the mail app be native. I prefer, well, Safari kind of, the web app has to be, the web browser has to be native. You're serving up mobile responsive content. I prefer apps like Pages that have really, really highly interactive UX to be native. But I guess the key is anything that's going to take serious advantage of the device should be native. So if you're going to be taking advantage of the accelerometer or geolocation, you should be native. There are certain JavaScript libraries that will allow you to geolocate, but I don't think they're going to be as good as the native. I can't prove that. But the native hardware is getting better and better, and I'm not sure what access levels JavaScript has into that world. When you are building out native, you have all of the graphics have been downloaded. Now, with the exception of very heavy offline or off-device content like Pinterest or Facebook or Yelp or something like that, if you're inside of a game or inside of your Photos app, all the content is on the device already. You don't have to download it. With responsive, every single thing is being downloaded. Your HTML, your JavaScript, your styles, your CSS coming through, all of the images and shading and all that. If you ever get curious, go and view the source on a web page. You'll see all of the extraneous files that are being brought in by a web page. You're downloading every single one of those files. You'll have like 6 or 7 CSS files and a handful of JavaScript files that are being downloaded. You're downloading every single one of those files. So that's the biggest difference for me, is that when you start up an app natively, it's just going to run. When you start up a responsive app, it's got to go and get the content. And you're stuck waiting until that content comes back before you can do anything. So once again, for me, apps that need to be native will be apps that need to take advantage of the device. Yeah.
You can still do responsive apps that become so proprietary to the device. For example, I develop catalogs.
Okay.
And they're fully responsive.
Okay.
But sometimes those catalogs are just reaching the web. But when I don't have an internet connection, I make sure that everything gets downloaded to the app.
In responsive?
In responsive.
Okay. So that was a good point. So you can there's a notion that perhaps with a responsive experience that you may not be able to download your content and keep it there for an offline experience, but you can. You can take advantage of basic web caching to cache content so that you can browse that offline. Is that what you're trying to say? Yeah. I mean, I'm not dogging native. I'm not dogging responsive at all. Like I said, there's a lot of use for responsive design out there.
Like you said, it's a lot faster to develop responsive sometimes.
Yeah.
I don't need to go native for what I do.
Right.
I develop responsive. If I have the use to be on a device, I do it this way. Everything gets downloaded to the device, and I'm done.
I think I know what you're saying. Are you happy or sad?
No, I'm happy. Me is in response to the customer.
Ah.
The customer doesn't want to spend the money to develop full native.
Right.
But they still need to have the content on the device if they choose to go offline.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So what he's saying is if the client doesn't have the budget to go fully native, but they need to have the content on the device. I mean, there's a ton of different ways to skin these cats, right? If a client comes into you and doesn't have the budget to do native, there's a way to figure it out almost all the time. They just have to know the pros and cons. So we often show them pros and cons, and it's up to them. I mean, if they're happy with the responsive UI, great, we're there. Yeah, I mean, I'm not weighing in one way or the other necessarily. I prefer iOS development right now. That's me.
So do I.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, totally. Yeah, we don't have the choice. So single columns generally work the best. Designed for fat fingers. That's probably what you were laughing at. Designed for fat fingers. Think tappable versus clickable. Remember, there's no hover state. So don't put it on over for your JavaScript. Nerds in the room. Space utilization is key. You can remove all that stuff. Every time we get called on to do responsive design, we do a quick overview of the page and start like removing bits that, all right, we don't need this anymore. We don't need this link to the home page. We don't need this. We don't need that. Speed is huge on mobile. You will lose a user in like seconds, right? Because normal use cases for mobile are tiny little experiences. They open the app, they do something, they get out. The exception being gaming or maybe large form content, long form content. Mostly you're in and you're out. You're on the L, you're standing in line at the grocery store, whatever. You're in, you're out. So if you've got a heavy responsive or a heavy web app that you're bringing in, you're going to want to make that thing as quick as possible. You're going to want to get rid of most of the CSS you can. You're going to want to get rid of most of the buttons and render things natively. It's going to be very, very critical getting that speed really well done on responsive. Would you agree? All right. And test often. That was kind of interesting. My design partner said test often. That was cool. It made me happy to see that. All right. Well, I guess I'm done. What time is it? I did pretty good. Okay. Any questions? So the question was, why do I think Netflix went the way they did? I think that they didn't want to spend any money experimenting. So I don't know that they thought that they were going to have a huge market on the mobile side of things. I think they thought that their money was going to be best spent delivering to set-top devices and to desktops. I don't think they saw mobile as a big win for them. And then when mobile became a big win and responsive was able to do the job, they were like, yeah, who needs to spend $300,000 to develop software where it's already working for us?
You say they did a web app and they pull in their content dynamically?
Yeah, so they basically have what we call a mobile shell. So it's a downloadable native piece that's got web components kind of configured in a way that you don't even know it exists. Yeah.
Where they would store their CSS.
You know, I don't think they probably don't cache anything because everything's got to be so fresh. I don't know for sure.
For Netflix, I don't know. I know from my case, I work for Sears, so we develop similar to Netflix or Facebook or whatever. So it's hybrid hub, and we do cache a lot. We do have a lot of files who are stored on the device, and some are code on demand. So it's a hybrid. So
Yeah.
It's a give and take. So you just have to be able to use what you need on a given time.
Yeah, yeah. It's basically, I mean, for those of you who didn't hear up here, it's basically give and take. When you're designing responsive app, it's how much do you want to bring down to the device in cache? How fresh do you want the content to be? He works at Sears.com. Sears' catalog is constantly refreshing. I mean, like every day that content is new, seasonally the content is changing. So their content is changing so rapidly, but yet they still cache things locally because it's still valuable for them to do that. So that's serious engineering right there. That's what that is. Anything else? Any other questions? Yeah. In the dark seats.
What's your favorite app and what do you think the future of app development?
Oh man, future of app development? Really? 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 My favorite app. The one I spend the most time in or the one I think is coolest? I'll do both. All right. The one I spend the most time in is Facebook Paper. And what I like about it is that it allowed me to stop rolling your eyes at me, Meredith. I teach adults, so I love yelling at adults, and that's my favorite part of the job. What I like about Facebook Paper is that it allows me to bring in my news content in the same form factor. So I view my headlines, my trendings, my tech, and my creative, and I spend most of my time in the news section and not watching my mom uploading pictures of cats and my sister complaining about our kids. I do, however, like all my wife's posts because, for those of you newly marrieds out there, like your wife's posts. The one I think is probably one of the best apps I've ever seen is called CIDD Mapper. Only because that they've really changed how maps work for me. So with CIDD Mapper, I can go in and say, I'm here, I want to get to this location, and it will give me all of the possible options. Walking, any bus, train options. It'll give me the arrival times of those basic transportations. And it'll give me rough travel time between here and my destination. It'll also give me walking distance, walking time, biking time, and jetpack time. So it's looking out for the future. Where I think mobile development is going, I'm pretty sure it's not going hybrid, meaning that I don't think we will ever see an environment where you can develop cleanly and efficiently for both platforms or all platforms in one tool. I don't think that'll ever happen. Right now, the tools that are out there to allow you to do that give you apps like Grubhub. So if you use Grubhub, you'll see that it's kind of clunky. It does the job well. It does exactly what it needs to do. And the guys at Grubhub are great, but they don't do native. They did it in a technology that translates to Objective-C and to Java. So it does lowest common denominator. You can only do that when you're using things that will work in both. So your cool graphics are gone because they're completely different on both platforms. So I don't think we will ever see a really good solution for that because we never saw it in desktop. And I don't count Java. I don't think Java came close to doing it. What I think might happen is I think we're going to get more and more design centric on the Apple side anyway. The Android side really hasn't caught up. The design tools in all flavors of Android IDEs that I've seen don't address the screen layout very well. But Apple is really concentrating on that really heavily to make it design friendly. So what I think is going to happen is I think we're going to see an area where we can get UX and design into the same tools that developers use and make it an even more seamless end-to-end development process. That's what I love to see. And based on what I'm seeing with Xcode right now, I think that's happening. All right, warning, my answers are long. Yeah. Yeah, what do you do? I mean, we've used jQuery mobile. So the question was, for responsive design, do I recommend any tools? I mean, any app engine is going to work fine because that's not where the guts of your mobile is. So if it's Java, any flavor of the Java servers or Rails or Django or any of that stuff or Drupal, any of that's going to be fine. Your responsive really comes in with the JavaScript, right? So what do you guys use at Sears?
Code, I mean, it changes a bit depending on the team we use, but
You guys write your own?
we do. Yeah.
Okay. So they're writing.
Our own too, and it is proprietary for some stuff.
Sure.
We use jQuery, we use JTouch, we use Ajax a lot as well. We use a lot of different flavors.
Okay.
It depends on the need as well, too.
So they're using a combination of Ajax, which is basically just hyped up JavaScript, jQuery, JTouch. Is it called JTouch? I'm not a JavaScript coder.
It's for the touch point.
Okay. And then some of their own proprietary stuff that they've written. So they've got some badass JavaScript engineers apparently.
I mean, it's, yeah.
'Cause I would never touch that stuff, man.
Our code is very proprietary because, I mean, we have templates.
Yep.
So we have a lot of content management system developed on our
Right.
So
That's where responsive really is takes off is where the JavaScript libraries are, because that's where you're gonna get all your bang for your buck on UX. Yeah. Yeah. You had your hand up.
Oh, I was going to add, a lot of people are making use of phone gap and accelerator.
Well, let's not say a lot of people. Let's say some people.
There's a lot of cross-platform development.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yep. So, right. So Grubhub. So the basic. What he said was a lot of people are using PhoneGap. What's the other one? Appcelerator. Yeah. So these are cross-platform development tools. What I was just decrying a moment ago. Because those I truly hate. I really hate them. Grubhub is written in PhoneGap, for instance. So if you use Grubhub, you can see what that experience is like. That's the best experience you're going to get out of PhoneGap, because they've got a full dev team over at Grubhub working on this stuff. And we've taught the mobile makers has taught them Android. So we know they have native capabilities in-house, and they're still doing PhoneGap. Yep, that exists. I will never do it, but it exists. And actually, there's one more one more area, the game development area. Stuff like Unity it's kind of cool, but I've never met a Unity developer that actually likes working in Unity. So there's amazing stuff you can do in it, and yeah, you can do JavaScript or C# inside of it. So you're cross-platform because it compiles natively to both, and then you're completely out of the UI environment for both platforms. But you're so boxed in with the development tools. I don't know any developers that actually like working in there. I spent about 6 months in Unity, and I had a development team, Unity-based guys, and nobody liked it. So that's that. Yeah. Have I ever seen an app that pulls in content from another app on the device? Okay. So that can't happen on iOS because iOS is all the apps are siloed. They're sandboxed. So the apps are completely and totally separate from each other and can't mess with each other's content. Any content that is going to be brought in is going to be through an API on the device. So a good example of that is the context database. There's a really crappy API on iOS that brings in contacts. So that's one example where you can bring in the contacts data ostensibly from that app into your app. On Android, though, I think the sky's the limit. I'm not an Android coder. I think the sky's the limit. I think you have the run of the operating system. So it's probably possible to do it. But if there's any Android developers in the room that can answer that. Nope? All right.
Well, what about a feature where like this feature is powered by this other website?
Websites, yes. Yeah, so you can bring, so if let's say you're an iPad app, right? And you've got this huge screen real estate. Yeah, you can bring in content from weatherchannel.com and content from Google and content from Yahoo, all on the same page. Absolutely. Web apps, no sweat.
I'm talking about like, okay, so I worked in an app where they created concert listings, and then you could say there's a whole feature within the app, but the content about the concerts and stuff was powered by SongKit.
Exactly. So they're using, so they're going to be using an API. So they're going to basically, just like the Facebook app or Pages is doing, they're going to go API to get all the data back and bring it back and display it natively.
I do research, and I'm learning about development.
Welcome aboard. Happy to have you. Yeah.
Well, it sounds like everybody's learning.
I'd love it. I'd love it. Yeah.
Without having to compile an Xcode, how do you have your designers and your developers communicate behaviors like movement?
Okay. So the question was, without getting everyone into Xcode, how do we have our designers in UX communicate movement? So we're a small shop. We're about 25 people. So we have the luxury of all sitting in the same place. So if you walk into our shop, we're not a dev shop. We're not a design shop. So you walk into our shop and you can't tell who's sitting where. We're all kind of sitting all over the place. We're all communicating based on project and not based on domain. So it's not all the developers sitting there talking about development. It's basically a team sitting there talking about product. So we just rely on good old collaboration and large form UX documents to communicate that. So development is in there from day one, and we're tracking UX features. And if UX wants to do something crazy out of budget, we're going to say, that's going to cost 10 grand more than the client wanted to pay, and we make the call right then and there whether to do it or not, or squash it or whatever, or we come up with other options right there as a team. So we do that. We solve that with good old-fashioned collaboration. Is that what you're talking about?
When you're using it stuff, like I can work in Xcode, I'm not compiling it. It's way too large
Okay.
for what we do, and I'm not getting into it. So just, we have an animation coming and everything stacks through. Just communicate that to your developer. We need to be using this type of motion. I use After Effects a little bit.
Oh, yeah.
You can't, it takes so long to compile, and
Yep.
then if you get pushed, how did it, yeah.
Look at you.
I'm not trying to throw out that term, but that's.
You do it. Throw them out. I'm impressed. Own it.
You get that communication with your developers because it's not the same in Xcode in terms of.
Well, sure. And most of the time, it's just being aware of patterns, right? So there's certain patterns in iOS that everyone is used to seeing. And every once in a while, somebody will come in and establish a new pattern. So like the slide-out menu, or this origami thing that's going on right now. But once a pattern comes out, we'll be able to describe it pretty quickly. So UX will say, I want this thing, I want this slide-out thing. And we all know what that means. So, the finessing thing is just like distributing it out, what we call test flighting it out because we use test flight, and having them test it and say, it's got to be faster, or just getting into a room and talking through that interaction. And the only time we ever use, we call them animatics, but After Effects mockups, the only time we ever do that is if we're working with a team that's not with us, and we do that so rarely that, I think the last time we did it was maybe 3 years ago. So, but After Effects is a really great way. If you're using a distributed team, it's a great way to communicate out because you can. What's that? Are you? Why is that? Why is that?